Hello, and welcome to the 61st Annual Seminar on Glass of the Corning Museum of Glass. My name is Amy McHugh, and I'm the Museum's Curator of Modern Glass. This year's seminar is focused on our special exhibition, Dig Deeper, Discovering an Ancient Glass Workshop, which closed in January. The theme of the session is, what does the present have to do with the past? You can place any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A feature, and you may use the chat feature to interact with other participants. Our technical support team is available to you as well. You may contact them at avuser@cmog.org or using the chat feature in the seminar lobby. We will have a bit of time at the end of the presentation for questions from the audience. The Corning Museum of Glass does not tolerate hate speech of any kind, and we ask that you please keep the comment section respectful and supportive. This morning, we are welcoming Dr. Alicia Fisher. Dr. Alicia Fisher is a hot glass artist and archaeologist with a PhD in anthropology and an MFA in studio art. She has worked on glass from archaeological sites in Israel and Jordan, and also conducted research with contemporary glass workers in Egypt, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, and the United States. Dr. Fisher will speak with us this morning on the subject of what the present can and can't tell us about ancient glass production. This is a pre-recorded talk since Alicia is unable to join us this morning. She would like to make a small correction on one place where she misspoke. She said Hebron was in Israel when it is located in the West Bank. Please welcome Dr. Fisher.
Today, I'm going to be talking about what the present can and can't tell us about ancient glass production. As an anthropological archaeologist, there are quite a few tools in the toolbox that I can use when I am looking at the glass from an excavation. And we have to start out with the excavation itself, where we have artifacts in context that we record as we are excavating, and then we publish. And I'll always take the opportunity to talk about the importance of publication because the archaeological record is destroyed when we excavate it. And so when somebody does an excavation and they do not publish it, it was a really expensive, destructive hobby. And I have done the glass from enough so-called dead digs. That's where an archaeologist has passed away prior to their publication, to tell you that it's very difficult to go back in to something somebody else excavated and understand their notes and everything that they wrote down, why they saved what they saved. They don't always write that down either. And so often there's not a lot you can tell about the artifacts at the site beyond this is what we have there. And that's really unfortunate when that happens. There's also archaeometric analyses, and there are a whole host of scientific techniques that we can use to tell us about the artifacts at our site. And that can happen out in the field, it can happen in lab, in museum settings. What's really important is to keep in mind that just because you have a piece of equipment, it doesn't mean it's the best piece of equipment for the question that you're asking. Experimental archaeology, and that is where people are trying to figure out how something was done in the past quite often. And so people who are looking at stone tools will spend time figuring out how lithics are made. They'll actually do some flint knapping themselves so that they can understand what they're seeing when they're seeing the debitage, the debris from the tool itself. And then we have ethnoarchaeological fieldwork, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today. It's a specialized form of ethnography conducted by archaeologists. And if you're familiar with ethnography, you may know that typically an ethnographer spends about a year with a particular group, writing about them and then going and publishing about them and hopefully seeing their annual cycle. What's different about ethnoarchaeological fieldwork is that it's done by archaeologists and it is very focused often. So I was looking at technology. I felt like that was something that I could look for and feel pretty comfortable if I see this particular mark or debris, that I would be getting information looking at contemporary glass artists that would help me to understand that. And so I did a more encyclopedic approach where I went to quite a few different glassworkers to look at what might be left in the archaeological record by their activities. So just to give some personal context for how I became a glassblowing archaeologist, I was really fortunate in 1991. I took my first glass art class from Stephen Rolfe Powell at Center College in Kentucky. I would go on to become a glass major. And I also, that following summer, went on my first archaeological excavation as a volunteer at the site of Sepphoris in northern Israel. And I'll explain how those two things came together quite quickly that summer. I did also include this picture from the 2002 Winter Olympics. As I was going through photos, one of the things that I found was this. And this was after my PhD, still working for Stephen Rolfe Powell. And the Corning Museum of Glass had called and said that they were going to have their mobile hot shop at the 2002 Winter Olympics, and would Steve like to come with his assistants and do a demonstration? And so we did that. The mobile hot shop back then was called the Hot Glass Roadshow. So here you can see the location of the site of Sepphoris in northern Israel, and we were predominantly working in Roman and Byzantine periods, though we also went up through the Islamic era. On this excavation that first summer, these are some of the things that I saw. And you can see next to the small handpick that we have the pieces of glass that had been overheated. And so they had to have been part of some sort of a manufacturing process, because why else would you find glass like that? And then you can also see nearby were some of these droplets that are also a byproduct of making glass vessels. And so as a 19-year-old, I looked and I said, oh, they've been making glass here, thinking it was obvious to the excavators, and it wasn't. Glass had historically been not looked at as seriously as things like ceramics, and so it was considered often a small find, and so that was not something they had a lot of expertise in, and so I, at that point, thought that I knew a lot. And turns out I actually didn't. But there were things that were making me think my experience within a United States hot shop was applicable to what I was seeing archaeologically 1700 years ago. So some of what I was looking at through my modern glassblower lens were these artifacts. And when I looked at these artifacts, what I saw were tool marks that I recognized. I saw an optic mold. You can see up in the corner there are two ring bases, and one of those, the one with the bubbles, was made using an optic mold, actually quite similar to the ones we use today. The one in the middle at the top is a piece of glass that has a bubble in it that is just so beautifully cut off of something while it's hot, presumably to get that bubble out of the piece. There were remains from pontiles, and you can see we've got that iron oxide on that glass up there, and also tweezers. So you can see there are actually marks from tweezers in that piece of glass, and also the ones in the center. Those are actually from Aphrodisias in Turkey, but they're a really good example of how well we can see the tool marks often on the glass. And you see I put all those things in quotes because that is how I understood them. I looked at those, and those were the tool categories that I had in my head. And the reason for that is those are the tools that I had. So you can see those are my jacks and my tweezers and my shears, and everything I was imagining having happened in the past, I was imagining happening with tools like that. And there is some evidence for it, but I also was looking at the way that I had made glass. So the framework that I had been trained in was a very Euro-American model. So You can see I'm sitting at a bench. I'm working with someone else that happens to be Shay Rhodes, who founded the glass program at the University of Louisville. And then behind us is a furnace that is using natural gas, as well as a separate device for reheating, and then a third one for annealing. So all these separate pieces of equipment, people working together, sitting at a bench. That was my framework. And what blew that all out of the water and really humbled me was walking into the Museum Haaretz in Israel and seeing this furnace, the Somalaria furnace, which was excavated in 1968 by Gladys Weinberg and Paul Perot, then the director of the Corning Museum of Glass. And what we see here is a partial reconstruction. And I was trying to understand how it worked, where was the fuel going in, where were things getting reheated, and I was a bit confused by this. And it's important to note that it was excavated very quickly. It was part of a salvage excavation, which that's what happens when you have construction or a road going through and something of cultural importance is found, needs to be documented, but also needs to not slow up the work. And so it just so happened that Gladys and Paul were in northern Israel looking for a site to start an excavation, and they got a phone call and were told, if you want to see this, you need to get down here right now. So this is from the 12th, 13th century, and so you might say, well, how does that relate to what you were looking at in the 3rd century? And what's super interesting is that we have depictions of glass furnaces on sarcophagi and on oil lamps that are very similar to this one. And so it looks like it was a pretty traditional craft in that for 1,000 years, people were using a pretty similar furnace type. But again, I struggled to understand this. But fortunately, I was a plucky graduate student, and I found out more about it by calling people. So I called up Gladys Weinberg and went and visited her in Columbia, and then I called up Paul Perot and I went and visited him in Sarasota to find out more about this excavation that very little was written about. And one of the things that happened was that Paul Perot shared with me the slides that he had taken in those 3, muddy, rainy days of excavation. And so it became clearer to me what was going on, because you can see a lot of that lower portion of the furnace that it is now reconstructed. And so it's really great to be able to see what they looked like when they were still in situ. So that's the importance of records right there. So to try to better understand what's going on in the archaeological record, I needed to go outside of my training. I needed to see other ways that glass could be worked, and also to look at how those ways of glass working would show up in the archaeological record. And so the first place that I went was Cairo, and this is a glass workshop that's outside of the old city of Cairo, and it's on the edge of the City of the Dead, that huge cemetery. And so originally it had been inside of the walls of the old city of Cairo, but like with many other glass workshops, there was a fire and they were kicked out. And so they were pushed, over to the edge of the cemetery with the other undesirables. And by undesirables, I mean other technologies that are particularly smelly or polluting. For example, on the way to this one, you walk past furniture makers who use hide glue, and if you've ever smelled that, you know that that is not something that people necessarily want to live right next to. And you could also tell that this was not intended for tourists. And the way you can tell is that everything's in Arabic. And if they wanted international tourists to come, they would have been using another language. And so you can look at the studio itself, and you can see people, some are sitting on the floor, some on stools. It is a mud brick furnace, and that's great. It was built before they switched fuels, so it had originally been a wood-burning furnace, and then they switched to used motor oil, and makes the glass much hotter, so it works differently. But it was good to see that original construction. The downsides to using used motor oil are the carcinogens, certainly. And the interior of that building, if you felt the walls actually feel oily. And so there's a lot of health concerns associated with that. Within the actual workshop, there was a little area where you could see some glass for sale. There was an actual showroom, probably 4 doors down. But you can see this is some of the wares that they had actually in the workshop itself. And if you ever read my book, you'll recognize that from the front cover. So we know that glass in antiquity was moving around the landscape in a couple of different ways. You had the raw materials coming in, being melted into glass, and then that glass moving to the places where it would actually be made into vessels or other objects, and then those objects would be moving around the landscape as well. And even sometimes you would see where glass had been gathered together in order to be remelted, to be recycled. And that's what's happening here. So one of the other groups that lives near this workshop are people who go through the garbage and they pick out everything that's useful and then they sell it to the people who will use it. And so you can see these are olive cans that are filled with different colors of glass, and so that's what they're melting. Their glass is really very bubbly, and one of the reasons could be because just because it's all green doesn't mean it's actually compatible. The furnace itself had all the components I was used to, but all in one, as opposed to 3 different pieces of equipment. And so you've got the central port where you're going to both get glass and reheat. There's the work surface in front, and then off to the left there is a hole, you'll see it better in another photo, where that's the annealing oven. And so the heat from the furnace is what is keeping it hot, and when they close it at the end of the day, it just cools down overnight. Very different from the computers that I was used to having do all of that, for me. It also meant that I got to see glass artists who made everything by themselves, not working with another person. You can see that this particular glass artist he is sitting on a chair. He's not sitting on the ground, although that was also happening. And he doesn't have a bench. If anything he's doing on his legs or he's doing on the equipment in front of him. And you can see the tool that he's using. That is like a combination jacks and tweezers. So that was one of the things that was helping me to see that the tools that I was using were not necessarily the tools that everyone would use to get the same effect. If it seems like I'm sharing with you all of my errors and my mistakes, that's because I am. I think it's really important for us to not only be able to admit when we've made mistakes, but to show how we've learned from them. And so this is an example where I asked a question, and I was really happy I asked it because I had made an assumption that turned out to be completely inaccurate. And so you can see here, we actually do have 2 people who are working together. They're not making vessels, they're making little glass blobs that will go into brass lamps. And so you can see that there's a younger man and an older man who are working on this together. And in the top photo, right above the young man's head is a mirror. And I had made an assumption that the purpose of that was epitropaic, that was something that would ward off bad things happening. There's a history of potters in particular putting things on their kilns as something to ward off bad things happening during the firing. And so I asked about that, and they thought it was pretty funny because they said, oh no, this young man, he likes to look at himself a lot, and that's why that's there. And it reminded me of how one of the things that archaeologists can do is fall into the trap of, if we don't understand it, it must be a ritual object. So I was right there doing the same kind of misinterpretation. I want to add in a couple of other sites just really quickly so you can understand what they added to the knowledge. So in Naur, Jordan, there is a glass workshop, and it was started by some glass artists who were from Hebron, which is in Israel. And so they had moved over to Jordan, but there was this 1400-year history of glassblowing in Hebron, and so they wanted to make sure that people knew that. So they had this sign out front. They also were using the same used motor oil, and talking about how it let them sleep longer, it doesn't take up as much space, you just have these 2 oil drums instead of a whole pile of wood, and you don't have to sit there all day and feed it, so one person can do it on their own. Um, and then we have the furnace design is different from what we saw in Cairo. And the biggest difference, besides that, there's actually a door that is opened and closed going into the furnace, both reheating and where you would get the glass. But then on the right, you can see what we have is a multi-stage annealing oven. And again, it comes off of the heat of the furnace, but what they would do is they would take the objects as they make them, they would put them in these little baskets that are made of olive oil containers, and then after a certain time period, they would move it down into that lower one so that it's a stepped cooling happening there. And here you can see how the glass artist is working, and one of the things that he's doing is he's behind this sort of pillar that is built there that keeps some of the heat away from the body. I was curious about their tools and who made those, whether they were handmade by them, whether they were purpose made for glass artists, or if they were reusing something else. And so you can see that there's some shears in there, and those would have been shears used for shearing animals, and so not glass specific. And that actually I saw that in quite a few places where some type of shear that was made for some other industry was being reused by the glass artists. But most of what you're looking at up there is something that they actually made themselves. The one outlier being those stamps that you see that they had machinists make specifically for them. And then how do we look at this archaeologically? How do we look at these sites and what can we learn from them? And so what we have here is out back, they were using as their source, they're using wine bottles from hotels. And so if we came upon this archaeologically and we just saw what would look like a room because of that foundation, you would probably think that that was a room, and you would see these huge piles of glass, which you wouldn't necessarily know if they were broken at the time that they were in use or if they got broken later. And so trying to understand what these piles would have been, this is one of the options, is that it could have been that they were recycling, and so they were just storing the glass that they were going to use. So I did finally find a wood-fired furnace, and unfortunately they were making small beads. They weren't making glass vessels, but I learned a lot from this furnace in Görece in Turkey. And one of the really interesting things is that in the mid-90s, when you would go around Turkey, the majority of the eye beads, the evil eye beads that you would find in the country were made in this village in the southwestern part of the country. And they were using small amounts of wood. I was actually quite surprised to see how little wood they were using. And you can see it's a very small port that it's going into in the middle of that image. And I changed some of my assumptions because I thought that, like ceramic industries, that glass industries also contributed heavily to deforestation. And when I saw the amounts that they were using, I realized it wasn't anywhere near the scale of what pottery had done to the landscape. And some of the things that we can learn additionally from that particular workshop, we can look at pollution. So we can see even when we have a wood-fired furnace that those walls are still covered. It's not oily like it is in Cairo, but it is soot that you would be able to see on walls archaeologically. You can also see how the tools are. They're being just stored up against the wall. There is raw glass. You can see turquoise and then like royal blue sitting there on the floor that would be put into the furnace. There is a ton of glass pushed into the floor just because it was a byproduct. And you can see some of that in the bead production photo. In between that bead and the furnace opening, there's all that kind of debris that would end up on the ground and would end up in the floor. So looking at a floor that is full of pieces of glass, and not in like a glass mosaic, but rather glass waste, that's a really good indicator that you might have a workshop in that area. And there's a final group I got to work with, And one of the things that I did not get to see when I was in the Middle East was anybody building a furnace. I would have been lucky even to see someone rebuilding a firebox, but that wasn't happening at the time. And it's not something you really get to see very often. But in 2002, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival got in touch with Dr. Robert Brill at Corning and asked him if he would engage with the Al-Ghazaz family from Syria who was coming to the Folklife Festival that year. And I will forever be thankful that he could not do it, and then he suggested that they call me. And I told them that I would be happy to spend the 2 weeks as an interpreter of the craft, so explaining to the public what was going on. But if I was going to do that, I wanted to be there for the furnace construction and seeing how that might happen. And so they agreed. And so I documented through video and photography the building of this furnace that was then just used for 2 weeks and then dismantled. And what was so interesting was that everything was just in the glass blower's head. He just knew how to do it, and he would get the materials. They didn't have all the materials he needed, and he would just improvise. And so that was a really fascinating thing to see. Some of the things that I could look at were things like who makes the tools. In his case, he didn't come with any tools. He had one piece of metal that he brought to put on the furnace as a sort of marver surface, but everything else he made. So he would just say, you know, I just basically need some pipes from a home supply store, and he cut them down, and then he did have access to a grinder where he could shape them, but everything he just made right there on site. You can see here he's also using a hammer to manipulate the shape of that blowpipe that he's made. His vessel production, pretty similar to what was going on in Jordan. So I didn't learn a whole lot of new information about this, except he used the side of the furnace quite a lot as a surface on which to flatten the vessels. And so you can see that in the other corner. That was a pretty interesting technique that he had there. He is sitting on a stool. Again, there's no bench. And you know, he let me work with the glass, and trying to learn how to not have a bench and just use your legs to roll it back and forth on, that was a really difficult thing to figure out how to do. So I've shown you a lot of what I found at contemporary glass workshops that we can then use to interpret the archaeological record. But what I want to end with is a little talk about the future of glass ethnoarchaeology. And what I have here is a quote from Carol Kramer, one of the leading ethnoarchaeologists of the 80s and 90s. And what she had to say about pottery ethnoarchaeology is absolutely accurate for glass ethnoarchaeology as well. Before the world's remaining traditional potters abandoned their craft in favor of more lucrative work, and before their wares are replaced by vessels of metal, plastic, rubber, and machine-made glass, archaeologists must take to the field so that cross-cultural generalizations about this crucial specialization can be formulated, refined, and operationalized. And I would argue that this is even more true for glass. And it's helpful to think about craft knowledge as like linguistic knowledge. So, like a language gets lost when we have the last native speaker die. When we have the last person who knows how to use a particular technique die, it can be very difficult to figure out how that was done. And we know this from revitalizing languages that, yes, you might get an approximation of it, but learning from a native speaker is better than anything else. And so what we want is to have more information in our interpretive toolbox, not just this is the one way it could have been done, but all of the different ways that maybe we didn't even think of. And so what we want to do is not say, hey, look, they did it exactly like this, right? That was my mistake at the beginning. But rather to say, Given the evidence that we have archaeologically and how people cross-culturally have worked with glass, we can reasonably argue that this may have been how they worked with glass at a particular site. Thank you.